Did your childhood just get body slammed by historical context? Were you happily enjoying rabbits, tea parties, and harmless cartoon nonsense? Until somebody ruined your entire week with facts? Well, friend, you may be suffering from acute Wonderland disorientation syndrome. Symptoms include staring at children's books suspiciously, yelling "what the hell" at documentaries, trust issues toward rabbits, panic during tea parties, and sudden emotional damage caused by Victorian England. Well, now there's help. Introducing the Wonderland Reality Adjustment Starter Kit. Inside every Deluxe Collector's package you'll receive the Trust No Rabbit Emergency Handbook, featuring over 400 pages of critical survival information, including Chapter 1. If a rabbit is wearing a suit, mind your damn business. Chapter 2. Do not follow strangers into holes. Chapter 3. If a cat disappears while smiling, relocate immediately. Amazing advice. Life-saving stuff. But wait. Call now, and you'll also receive the Victorian England Stress Ball. Just squeeze repeatedly every time history reveals another absolutely horrifying fact. Examples include: wait, they gave what to babies? Squeeze. Hold on, they poisoned workers? Squeeze. They cut how many diary pages? Squeeze violently. And that's not all. You'll also receive the official Mad Hatter Mercury Test Kit. Simply point at random authority figures screaming nonsense and ask, is this madness or management? Results may surprise you. Warning. Side effects include distrust of literary symbolism, excessive rabbit paranoia, sudden urges to research 19th century history at 2:47 a.m., asking friends if tea parties were always so suspicious. Operators are standing by. Mostly because nobody in Victorian England believed in labor laws. Call now, because Wonderland was fake. Victorian England somehow wasn't. Pizzaverse Studios. Ruining childhoods through historical context since day one. Viewer discretion is advised. This documentary contains historical discussion, satire, commentary, literary analysis, Victorian weirdness, and enough childhood damage to make somebody stare at a rabbit and immediately say, nah, I don't trust him. Before anyone starts launching themselves through drywall screaming, you ruined Alice in Wonderland. Relax. Nobody is accusing rabbits of organized crime. Nobody is suggesting the Mad Hatter was operating a narcotics cartel. Nobody is claiming Wonderland violated federal regulations. This presentation explores historical interpretations, themes, and literary theories surrounding Alice in Wonderland. If at any point you begin questioning every story from your childhood, congratulations. You're doing history correctly. Now, unfortunately, we begin.
Pizzaverse Studios. Palermo Productions. Alice in Wonderland, the Dark Secrets Hidden Inside the Rabbit Hole. Written by Bambi Palermo. Narrated by Vincent D. Prio. You know the story. A curious girl falls down a rabbit hole into a world of talking animals, mad tea parties, and nonsensical riddles. For over a century, Alice in Wonderland enchanted generations with whimsical characters and dreamlike adventures. Simple enough. Except not really. Because hidden underneath the smiling cats, strange potions, and colorful nonsense sits something much darker. Something buried beneath Victorian England itself. Because once you understand the historical context behind Lewis Carroll's masterpiece, you never see Wonderland the same way again. Because this wasn't just fantasy. This may have been an exposé disguised as a bedtime story. And ladies and gentlemen, today we're going down the rabbit hole. The boat ride that changed everything. The story begins on a seemingly innocent summer day in 1862. A mathematics lecturer from Oxford named Charles Dodgson boarded a small rowboat for what should have been an ordinary afternoon trip along the river with 3 young sisters. One of them was 10-year-old Alice Liddell. The day itself sounded harmless. Sunny skies. Calm water. A simple outing. Nothing about it looked like the beginning of one of the most influential stories ever written. But history has a weird habit of hiding major moments inside ordinary afternoons. Because during the trip, Alice grew restless. Like kids have done since the beginning of civilization. And somewhere along that river, she asked Dodgson to tell a story. Not just any story. She wanted something strange. Something silly. Something filled with nonsense. And Charles Dodgson began improvising. He introduced a curious little girl, a rabbit, a hole, a bizarre world where rules collapsed and logic started drinking heavily before showing up to work. The girls loved it, especially Alice. Over the following months, she repeatedly asked him to write the story down. Eventually, he did. By hand. With illustrations. A private manuscript called Alice's Adventures Underground. Simple enough. Except historians later noticed something strange. Because the version written for Alice herself feels different. Smaller. More personal. Almost intimate. Like a private world built for one specific child. But years later, the public version exploded into something larger. Stranger. Darker. And packed with symbolism people are still arguing about today. Because once the story entered print, something changed. Suddenly, literary scholars saw political satire. Psychologists saw dream logic. Historians saw coded social criticism. Mathematicians saw hidden jokes. And conspiracy people looked at the whole thing and said, "Hold on a second." Because apparently human beings cannot leave anything alone. Give us a talking rabbit, and eventually somebody starts building a corkboard covered in red string. Amazing. But one mystery sat above everything else. Who exactly was Charles Dodgson? And what truly existed between him and Alice Liddell? Because after his death, people began noticing things missing. Pages. Letters. Records. Entire pieces of history. And once that happened, the rabbit hole got a lot deeper. What emerged from his imagination that day would become one of the most analyzed texts in literary history. and maybe one of the most misunderstood. The missing diary pages. History has a funny way of acting suspicious. Not because somebody proves a conspiracy. Not because smoke suddenly starts pouring out of secret government basements. No. Usually it's because somebody starts deleting things. And in the case of Lewis Carroll, things disappeared. A lot of things. Because after Charles Dodgson died in 1898, historians began examining his personal papers, journals, and diaries, hoping to better understand the man behind Wonderland. And at first, everything looked normal. Painfully normal. Schedules, meetings, weather notes, academic nonsense. Victorian people loved documenting absolutely everything. These people treated journaling like federal surveillance. Breakfast at 8, tea at noon, talked to Margaret at 2, saw cloud formation, excellent weather, fantastic. But then researchers noticed something strange. Several pages were gone. Not misplaced. Not damaged naturally. Removed. Cut out. Entire sections. Missing. Gone. Like somebody reached into history itself and performed surgery. And these weren't random pages either. Some of the missing materials centered around periods involving Alice Liddell and her family. Now suddenly historians had questions. Big questions. Because when historians see pages physically removed from journals, their brains immediately start doing backflips. Who removed them? Why? And maybe more importantly, what was written there? Researchers later discovered notes indicating family members themselves may have removed portions after Dodgson's death. One notation written by relatives essentially acknowledged missing entries, which somehow made everything feel even stranger. Because now this wasn't accidental. Someone made a choice. Someone looked at written history and decided, yeah, we're gonna need the scissors. Nothing suspicious there. Totally normal behavior. You know, just a casual evening in Victorian England. Making tea. Reading journals. Performing emergency literary surgery beside the fireplace. No big deal. And according to some accounts, certain materials may have been destroyed entirely. Burned. Gone forever. Now historians hate that. Historians hear burned documents the same way horror movie characters hear footsteps in the basement. Because once evidence disappears, imagination takes over. Some scholars argue the missing pages contained innocent family matters. Others believe they may have involved disagreements, social complications, or concerns surrounding Carroll's relationships. And then, the darker theories arrived. Because of course they did. Internet people saw missing diary pages and immediately went, "All right, everybody, calm down. I solved the entire case at 3:40 in the morning." Suddenly, theories exploded. Hidden scandals. Suppressed relationships. Victorian cover-ups. Secret truths buried by powerful families. The problem, nobody knows. Because that's the nightmare. Missing evidence creates empty space. And empty space is where human beings become absolute animals. We fill gaps. We invent stories. We build monsters. Sometimes we're right. Sometimes we're hilariously wrong. But once pages disappear, certainty disappears with them. And over a century later, historians still stare at those missing sections like detectives standing over a crime scene. Because the pages Lewis Carroll wrote may be gone, but the questions they left behind, those never disappeared. And unfortunately, things get even stranger from here. The shadow over Lewis Carroll. And here's where the documentary walks into uncomfortable territory. Because for over a century, one question has followed Lewis Carroll everywhere. Not his books. Not his mathematics. Not Wonderland. Him. Because Charles Dodgson, the man behind the pen, named Lewis Carroll, formed close friendships with children throughout his life, particularly young girls. And historians have argued over those relationships for generations. Some describe him as socially awkward. Others describe him as deeply lonely. Some portray him as a harmless eccentric trapped inside rigid Victorian culture. Others look at the same material and go, hold on a second. Because Victorian England operated under social rules that look completely alien today. Photography was new. Social customs were different. Adult friendships with children, while still not viewed casually, often existed inside social circles in ways modern audiences immediately find uncomfortable. And Lewis Carroll became deeply involved in those circles. He entertained children, invented games, told stories, performed magic tricks, created puzzles. And he especially connected with the daughters of wealthy families, including the Liddells, including Alice. Now here's where things become complicated. Because Alice Liddell inspired Wonderland. That part isn't debated. But historians have spent generations arguing over what exactly existed between Dodgson and the family. Because in 1863, roughly a year after that famous boat trip, something happened. Suddenly, contact between Dodgson and the Liddells cooled dramatically. Almost overnight. And for years, nobody knew why. Remember those missing diary pages? Yeah. Those pages happened to cover this exact period. Amazing. Of course they did. Because apparently every time history gets close to giving us answers, somebody runs in carrying scissors. Now, over time, scholars piece together fragments from surviving notes and family records. One interpretation suggests gossip emerged surrounding Dodgson and possible marriage discussions involving older members of the family. Others believe tensions grew from misunderstandings. Some think social politics simply got messy. Victorian society loved messy social politics. These people treated passive aggression like an Olympic event. But because the original records disappeared, certainty disappeared too. And then there's photography. Because Carroll was also an obsessive photographer. He took thousands of images. Landscapes. Friends. Families. Children. Some portraits involved costumes or artistic themes that modern audiences often react to with immediate discomfort. Supporters argue these reflected accepted artistic traditions of the era. Critics argue something darker may have existed beneath the surface. and historians remain divided. That's important, because despite decades of speculation, no definitive evidence has ever proven many of the darker accusations thrown at Lewis Carroll. But the mystery itself never died, because human beings hate unanswered questions, especially when children, missing records, and strange behavior all start appearing in the same story. The result? Lewis Carroll became two people. To some, a brilliant storyteller and eccentric academic. To others, a shadowy historical figure surrounded by unanswered questions. And maybe that's the real reason Wonderland still unsettles people. Because the deeper you go into the story, the harder it becomes separating fantasy from reality. And unfortunately, the rabbit hole keeps going. The story changes. Most people assume stories appear fully formed, like lightning strikes. One moment, nothing exists. Then suddenly, boom, masterpiece, roll credits. But that isn't usually how it works. Stories evolve, they mutate, they grow strange little limbs. And Alice in Wonderland may be one of the strangest examples of all. Because the first version wasn't the Wonderland most people know. Before millions of books, before animated films, before the tea parties and grinning cats became part of pop culture, there was a private manuscript. A handmade book called Alice's Adventures Underground, created specifically for Alice Little, not for the public, not for critics, not for literary immortality, just one child. And historians who compare that early version to the later published work notice something immediately. They're not the same story. Not really. The skeleton remains. The rabbit appears. Alice still falls. The dream world still exists. But something happened between private gift and public release. Wonderland became bigger, stranger, more chaotic, and far more layered. Characters expanded, dialogue changed, new scenes appeared, symbolism multiplied, and suddenly people began finding meanings hidden everywhere. Some scholars saw political satire, some saw critiques of education, others saw philosophical jokes. Mathematicians discovered absurdist puzzles hidden beneath nonsense dialogue. And literary historians started noticing something strange. The more Wonderland grew, the less it behaved like a children's story. Because underneath the fantasy sat anxiety, confusion, identity crises, power structures collapsing, authority figures acting insane. Adults making rules nobody understands. Honestly, sounds less like fantasy and more like trying to survive modern life. Amazing. Because look at Wonderland closely. Nothing works properly. Authority figures scream nonsense. Rules change constantly. Trials happen before evidence. People panic over nothing. Everybody speaks confidently despite having absolutely no idea what's happening. Suddenly, Wonderland starts feeling less like a dream and more like somebody wrote a satire after spending 6 hours trapped at the DMV. And that raised a question. What exactly changed inside Lewis Carroll's mind between the private Alice story and the published one? Because maybe success simply made him expand the world. Maybe his imagination evolved. Or maybe once the story moved beyond one little girl and entered public life, Wonderland became a vehicle. A place where absurdity could quietly expose reality. Because satire has always worked that way. You hide difficult truths beneath comedy. You disguise criticism beneath nonsense. You make people laugh before they realize what they're actually hearing. And over a century later, people are still arguing about whether Wonderland was fantasy or camouflage. Because once stories leave their creators, they stop belonging to them. They become mirrors, and every generation sees something different staring back. Unfortunately for us, Victorian England left behind plenty to stare at. The Opium Empire hiding in plain sight. Now here's where Wonderland starts getting real weird. Because when modern audiences look at Alice in Wonderland, they usually notice the obvious stuff first. A girl drinks mysterious liquids. Her body changes size. Reality bends. Time behaves like it got hit in the head with a shovel. Animals talk. Logic collapses. And eventually, somebody always says, "Okay, was everybody on drugs? Easy there." Because as funny as that sounds, Victorian England had a relationship with drugs that was absolutely insane. Not secret drug culture. Not underground activity. Not dark alley transactions. Normal life. Completely normal. Because during the 19th century, Britain wasn't just consuming opium. Britain practically built an empire around it. Entire economies moved around the drug trade. Governments fought wars over it. Real wars. Actual military conflicts. Because Britain pushed opium into China on an industrial scale, leading to the Opium Wars. Millions of lives became tangled inside one of the largest drug economies in history. And back home, things somehow got even crazier. Because ordinary citizens could legally buy opium products almost everywhere. No prescription. No warning labels. No dramatic pharmaceutical commercials listing side effects while people smile in slow motion through wheat fields. Nothing. You walked into a shop. You bought it. Done. One of the most common forms was a substance called laudanum. And laudanum was everywhere. Medicine cabinets. Households. Doctors. Families. Rich people. Poor people. Everybody. Basically, Victorian England looked at highly addictive narcotics and said, "Yeah, this seems fine. Amazing." Laudanum was a mixture of alcohol and opium. People used it for pain, sleep, stress, anxiety, coughing, headaches, depression, and occasionally because existing in Victorian England probably required chemical assistance. By modern standards, the entire thing sounds absolutely bananas. And now people started looking back at Wonderland differently. Because Alice repeatedly consumes strange substances. Drink this. Eat that. Suddenly she's larger. Suddenly she's smaller. Suddenly reality feels distorted. Identity begins slipping. Time behaves strangely. The world becomes dreamlike. Now historians and literary scholars disagree on how far these interpretations go. Some argue the symbolism is overstated. Others believe Wonderland unintentionally mirrors experiences familiar to 19th century readers surrounded by drug culture. Important distinction. Because there is no definitive evidence Lewis Carroll wrote Wonderland as an opium manifesto. None. But context matters. Because people don't create stories inside a vacuum. Writers absorb the worlds around them. And 19th century Britain existed under the shadow of one of history's largest drug economies. Suddenly, Wonderland starts feeling less like random nonsense, and more like a distorted mirror. Because maybe the strangest thing wasn't Wonderland itself. Maybe it was the world that created it. And unfortunately, Victorian England wasn't done poisoning people yet. The babies Victorian England poisoned. Now, if that part sounded bad, this next part somehow gets worse. Because when people imagine Victorian England, they picture elegance, fancy dresses, teacups, horse carriages, gentle piano music, people politely saying things like, "Good heavens." Meanwhile, reality was sitting in the corner looking like, what the hell are these people doing? Because beneath the polished image sat a horrifying truth. Victorian England gave narcotics to children. Regularly. Not hidden. Not secretly. Not underground. Openly. And somehow it was considered normal. Because among the most common household products of the era was something called Godfrey's cordial. Sounds harmless, right? Sounds like a nice old guy who fixes watches and waves at neighbors. Nope. Godfrey's cordial was essentially a mixture containing opium, and people gave it to babies. Babies. Actual infants. To make them sleep. To stop crying. To keep them quiet. Because when exhausted families worked brutal factory hours and survival itself felt impossible, many turned to these mixtures as solutions. Factories demanded long labor. Poverty crushed households. Childcare barely existed. And opium became the shortcut. The result, absolute nightmare fuel. Because prolonged use often caused addiction, severe illness, developmental problems, and death. Some infants became lethargic. Some stopped eating. Some simply never woke up. And for years, people either ignored it or barely understood what was happening. Amazing. Victorian England really looked at infant sedation and said, "Yeah, this feels medically responsible." Meanwhile, modern audiences hear this and immediately want to fight a time machine. And then literary historians noticed something unsettling inside Wonderland. The Duchess's baby. Remember that scene? The screaming infant passed around inside complete chaos. Eventually, Alice notices something disturbing. The baby starts changing. Twisting. Transforming. Until finally it becomes a pig. Which sounds ridiculous. Until scholars began interpreting it symbolically. Because some literary critics argued the scene reflected neglect, distorted childhood, or the way Victorian society treated children as burdens to manage rather than human beings to protect. Others believe Carroll simply wrote absurd comedy. because Wonderland constantly weaponizes nonsense. But once you understand what Victorian children actually experienced, the scene starts feeling different. Because suddenly chaos isn't funny anymore. It's uncomfortable. A crying infant trapped in a world where adults barely understand what they're doing. Authority figures behaving irrationally. Children push through systems they never chose. And underneath all of it sits a society quietly drugging people just to keep things moving. That's where Wonderland starts becoming unsettling. Because every ridiculous image starts carrying weight. Every joke starts feeling like it might be aimed at something real. And the deeper you look, the harder it becomes pretending Wonderland was built from pure fantasy. Because while Alice escaped her strange world eventually, millions of Victorian children never escaped theirs. And unfortunately, the next chapter introduces a character who wasn't fictional at all. The Mad Hatter wasn't fiction. Now we arrive at one of the most famous characters in literary history. The wild eyes, the tea party, the strange behavior, the non-stop nonsense, the complete inability to act like a normal human being for more than 3 consecutive seconds. The Mad Hatter. A character so iconic that people rarely stop to ask an important question. Why a hatter? Seriously, Lewis Carroll could have picked anything. The Mad Shoemaker, the Mad Baker, the mad guy standing outside feeding birds. Instead, he chose a hat maker. And once you understand 19th century history, that choice gets real uncomfortable. Because during the Victorian era, hat makers had a serious problem. Their jobs were poisoning them. Literally. Because many hat factories used mercury nitrate during production, especially while treating felt. Workers handled toxic materials constantly, day after day, year after year, breathing it, touching it, living inside it. And over time, their bodies started breaking down because mercury poisoning can produce tremors, memory problems, mood swings, speech issues, anxiety, hallucinations, paranoia, behavioral changes. Eventually, workers developed symptoms so common people started associating them with the profession itself. Hence the phrase, mad as a hatter. And no, Lewis Carroll didn't invent that expression. It already existed, meaning audiences of the time immediately understood the joke. Meanwhile, modern readers just see a weird guy having tea with a rabbit and a tiny screaming bird. Different experience entirely. Because Victorian readers looked at the Hatter and thought, oh, not, what a lovable eccentric. More like, that poor bastard got poisoned at work. Amazing. Industrial England really said, congratulations on your employment. Side effects include madness. Now historians debate exactly how intentionally Carroll used this material. Some scholars argue the Hatter simply borrowed an existing phrase. Others believe Carroll absolutely understood the social meaning behind it. And honestly, considering how much hidden satire people already see inside Wonderland, it's hard not to raise an eyebrow. Because look at the Hatter closely. Time itself breaks around him. Conversations go nowhere. Logic collapses. Everything feels trapped, frozen, disconnected. He's stuck endlessly sitting at a table while reality refuses to move forward. And suddenly this bizarre comedy scene starts feeling less funny. Because underneath the chaos sits something tragic. A worker damaged by the very system meant to sustain him. A man slowly destroyed by his profession. A joke with poison hiding inside it. And unfortunately, the nightmare didn't stop with the Hatter, because the factories themselves were even worse. Off with their heads. Now we finally arrive at the human embodiment of calm leadership, emotional stability, and rational decision-making. The Queen of Hearts. A woman whose primary conflict resolution strategy appears to be screaming, "Off with their heads!" every 6.5 seconds. Parking issue? Execution. Bad mood? Execution. Mild inconvenience? Straight to execution. Victorian HR departments would have loved this lady. Because as ridiculous as the Queen seems, historians and literary scholars have spent years asking a question. Was she actually based on someone? Or more specifically, was she based on multiple someones? Because beneath the screaming and absurdity, many researchers believe the Queen of Hearts may draw from real historical tensions, especially echoes of England's violent past, including the Wars of the Roses. Now the name alone starts setting off alarm bells. Because the Wars of the Roses were brutal political struggles fought between rival royal houses, represented by symbols: the red rose, the white rose. Families turned on families. Power shifted constantly. Loyalty became temporary. And England spent decades behaving like a reality show written by deeply unstable people. Kings overthrown. Claims challenged. Executions everywhere. Political alliances changing overnight. Basically, medieval England looked at peace and said, absolutely not. Now, no serious historian claims Lewis Carroll secretly wrote a direct historical textbook. But satire often borrows pieces, symbols, names, fragments. And Wonderland loves doing exactly that. Because the Queen's kingdom makes absolutely no sense. Rules change whenever she wants. Punishments arrive before evidence. Fear controls everything. People panic the moment she appears. Nobody respects authority. They survive authority. Big difference. And suddenly Wonderland starts looking less like fantasy and more like a parody of power itself. Because look at how justice works around her. Nobody asks questions. Nobody investigates. Nobody cares whether accusations are true. Somebody gets blamed and the system immediately starts warming up the guillotine. Efficient. Terrifying. And honestly, not as fictional as we'd like. Because throughout history, power structures often survive through spectacle, not logic. Fear. Performance. Control. The Queen screams constantly because screaming is the point. Authority loves theater. Always has. And underneath all the absurdity, Carroll may have been quietly asking a dangerous question. What happens when power becomes ridiculous? Because ridiculous authority still hurts people. Maybe even more. Since people stop recognizing it. That's what makes the Queen unsettling. Not because she's evil. Because she's familiar. Every generation sees somebody inside that character. A politician. A ruler. A boss. A system. Someone loudly demanding obedience while everybody else quietly pretends things make sense. And unfortunately for Alice, the people in Wonderland weren't the only ones trapped inside irrational systems. Because Victorian children had one waiting for them too. The classroom prison. Now, if Wonderland was a world filled with bizarre rules, arbitrary authority, and adults demanding absolute obedience, Victorian children probably looked around and said, "So school, basically." Because education during the Victorian era wasn't designed around creativity. It wasn't built around curiosity. It wasn't about personal growth. It definitely wasn't about helping children discover themselves. No. Victorian education had one mission: create obedience. That was the game. Sit down. Be quiet. Memorize. Repeat. Don't question authority. Don't challenge ideas. Don't speak unless spoken to. And above all else, do not become interesting. Amazing. Because apparently society looked at children and decided, you know what this tiny developing human needs? More military energy. Schools in Victorian England often ran with strict discipline and rigid hierarchy. Teachers carried enormous authority. Punishments could be severe. Humiliation was common. Fear wasn't a side effect. Fear was part of the structure. Children learned through repetition. Recitation. Rules. Routine. And if you didn't fit the system, too bad. The system wasn't changing. You were. Or at least you were supposed to. And then literary scholars looked back at Wonderland and noticed something strange. Alice spends almost the entire story trapped inside situations where rules make no sense. People ask impossible questions. Adults demand impossible answers. Conversations feel like tests designed specifically to make somebody fail. Sound familiar? Because the classroom scenes hidden inside Wonderland are everywhere. Alice repeatedly tries applying lessons she learned in the real world. Mathematics. Poetry. Logic. Rules. And every time, everything falls apart. She remembers things incorrectly, recites material wrong, misunderstands herself. The world stops following the instructions she was taught. And suddenly Wonderland starts feeling like a nightmare version of school itself. Imagine spending your whole childhood learning rules, then entering a world where the rules suddenly betray you. No wonder Alice spends half the story looking confused. Honestly, I'd be confused too. Everybody around her talks like they just escaped a philosophy convention after 6 straight hours of espresso. But beneath the comedy sits something darker. Because Wonderland may be quietly mocking educational systems that valued obedience more than understanding. Systems where memorization mattered more than thought. Where children adapted to structures instead of structures adapting to children. And once again, Wonderland starts behaving less like fantasy and more like satire. Because Alice isn't simply wandering through nonsense. She's surviving institutions, authority figures, rules, expectations, systems, The same systems Victorian children navigated every day. And eventually that creates a dangerous question. If the world keeps changing around you, if authority stops making sense, if every rule suddenly breaks, then who exactly are you? And unfortunately, that's where Wonderland gets personal. Who in the world am I? Now things stop being historical for a minute. Because this chapter gets weird in a different way. Not poisoned hat weird. Not opium weird. Not screaming queen weird. Identity weird. Because one of the most important lines in Alice in Wonderland isn't about rabbits, or tea, or madness. It's Alice asking, who in the world am I? And suddenly the whole story changes. Because underneath all the chaos and absurdity, Alice spends nearly the entire book struggling with one thing. Herself. Not physically. Personally. Because from the moment she enters Wonderland, her body starts changing. Constantly. Too big. Too small. Too tall. Too tiny. Nothing stays stable. One minute she can barely fit inside a room. The next she can hardly reach a table. And after enough changes, Alice finally reaches a breaking point. Because eventually she starts wondering whether she's even still Alice. Think about how disturbing that actually is. You're trapped somewhere unfamiliar. Nothing follows logic. Reality changes every 10 minutes. Your body stops behaving normally. Nobody explains anything. And eventually your brain goes, hold on, am I still me? That is nightmare fuel. And literary scholars have spent years digging into this. Some interpret Alice's changing size as symbolism for childhood itself. Growing up. Puberty. Confusion. Identity shifts. The terrifying realization that becoming older feels like becoming a stranger. Others see philosophical questions hidden beneath the fantasy. Because Wonderland repeatedly asks, if everything around you changes, what remains? Who are you when your environment changes? Who are you when your role changes? Who are you when authority changes? And then mathematicians entered the conversation. Because apparently Wonderland wasn't complicated enough already. Remember, Lewis Carroll wasn't just a writer. He was a mathematics lecturer. And some researchers believe parts of Wonderland quietly parody changing 19th century mathematical theories. Because during Carroll's lifetime, traditional systems of logic and mathematics were evolving. New concepts appeared. Old certainty started cracking. Suddenly, long-standing ideas looked unstable. And Carroll, being a mathematician, was not exactly thrilled about every new trend. Some scholars think Wonderland contains hidden jokes aimed at these changes. Not obvious jokes. Math jokes. Which somehow feels even more dangerous. Imagine being roasted by advanced Victorian mathematics. Absolutely brutal. Because now Wonderland becomes something stranger. A world where logic itself starts malfunctioning. A place where certainty breaks. Where rules shift. where identity slips. And maybe Alice's question wasn't really, "Who am I?" Maybe it was, "Who am I when the world around me stops making sense?" Because eventually everybody asks that question. Children ask it. Adults ask it. Societies ask it. And Wonderland never really gives an answer. It just keeps moving. Because next, Alice enters a courtroom where logic finally dies completely. The courtroom of Wonderland. And now we arrive at what may be the single most ridiculous scene in the entire story. Which is saying a lot. Because Wonderland already gave us disappearing cats, poison hats, screaming royalty, and a rabbit operating under permanent workplace anxiety. But then Lewis Carroll looked at all of that and said, "You know what this story needs? A courtroom." Fantastic. Because Alice eventually enters a trial involving the alleged theft of tarts. Not murder. Not treason. Not some elaborate criminal conspiracy. Pastries. We're holding legal proceedings over baked goods. Meanwhile, everybody inside the courtroom behaves like they collectively suffered head injuries. Evidence makes no sense. Witnesses ramble. Procedure collapses. Rules change constantly. And the verdict appears ready before anyone even bothers proving anything. Sound familiar? Because historians and literary scholars have argued for years that this scene wasn't random absurdity. It may have been satire. And Victorian England gave Carroll plenty of material. Because despite all the polished images of order and civilization, the legal system often operated with deep inequalities. Class mattered. Status mattered. Reputation mattered. Justice sometimes depended less on truth and more on who you were. Or who you knew. Amazing. Human beings invent equal justice under the law and immediately start looking for loopholes. Now, some scholars have connected Wonderland's courtroom chaos to broader Victorian anxieties surrounding legal spectacle and public scandal. Others point toward cases involving harsh punishment and public fascination with crime, including figures like Mary Barrett and broader debates around morality, class, and public judgment. Because trials during the era weren't always about facts. Sometimes they became theater, performance, spectacle. The public wanted stories. Heroes. Villains. Drama. Honestly, sounds suspiciously familiar. Because today people gather online and conduct entire court cases inside comment sections. No evidence. No witnesses. No due process. Just vibes. Humanity really looked at centuries of legal evolution and said, "Nah, let's go back." But Wonderland pushes that absurdity to its breaking point. People talk over each other. Authority becomes meaningless. Logic stops functioning. And eventually Alice reaches a moment of clarity. She stands up and realizes, none of this makes sense. None of it. The entire structure survives because everybody keeps pretending it's real. And suddenly, Wonderland reveals one of its biggest ideas. Systems only work while people agree to participate. Once somebody says, "Wait, this is ridiculous," the illusion starts cracking. Because maybe Wonderland wasn't mocking individual people. Maybe it was mocking institutions, systems, authority itself. And once Alice sees through the performance, Wonderland starts falling apart. Because next, we reach the question that's haunted this story for over a century. What was Wonderland actually trying to say? The real Wonderland. Children saw adventure. Adults saw satire. Historians saw something else entirely. A coded map of Victorian England's darkest secrets. And maybe that is why people never stopped arguing about Alice in Wonderland. Because the deeper researchers looked, the stranger things became. One generation saw harmless fantasy. The next saw social criticism. Then came psychology, political interpretation, mathematics, drug symbolism, Victorian nightmares hidden beneath smiling animals. Suddenly, Wonderland became less like a story and more like an archaeological dig. Because every few years, somebody climbed down into the rabbit hole and came back carrying a completely different answer. Some people believed Wonderland was a critique of education. Others saw political satire. Some saw a dream narrative reflecting childhood anxiety. Others believed Carol quietly mocked the absurd structures surrounding Victorian life. And some people looked at all of this and built conspiracy walls so large they probably needed building permits. Amazing? Because human beings cannot resist mystery. Give us missing diary pages and suddenly everybody transforms into a detective. Give us symbolism and suddenly somebody's cousin on the internet becomes a literary expert after watching 3 videos and drinking an energy drink at 2 in the morning. But beneath all the theories, beneath all the arguments, one thing becomes difficult to ignore. Wonderland behaves less like escapism and more like distortion. A mirror. A carnival reflection of reality. Because look at everything Alice encounters. Authority figures screaming nonsense. Systems that reward confusion. Systems that reward confusion. Adults behaving irrationally. Rules changing constantly. Institutions demanding obedience while making absolutely no sense. People trapped inside structures nobody understands. Honestly, Alice didn't fall into fantasy. She fell into society. Victorian society. Just exaggerated enough to make people laugh before realizing they probably shouldn't be. And maybe that was Carol's trick. Not hiding darkness inside a children's story. Hiding a children's story inside darkness. Because satire works best when people don't realize they're reading it. And over 150 years later, people are still arguing over whether Wonderland exposed hidden truths, or simply reflected a world already spiraling into absurdity. Maybe that's why Alice in Wonderland survives. Because every generation finds something new hidden inside it. As children, we see magic. As adults, we see chaos. And as historians, we realize Wonderland may have looked ridiculous because reality already was. Turns out the strangest place Alice ever visited was Victorian England. Wonderland mirrors reality. Maybe that's why Alice in Wonderland survives. Because every generation finds something new hidden inside it. As children, we see magic. As adults, we see chaos. And as historians, we realize Wonderland may have looked ridiculous because reality already was. Turns out the strangest place Alice ever visited was Victorian England. Because after everything, the missing diary pages, the uncomfortable questions, the opium culture, the poisoned workers, the broken systems, the screaming queens, the classrooms, the courtrooms, the madness, you start realizing something. Wonderland wasn't frightening because it ignored reality. Wonderland was frightening because it borrowed from it. And maybe that explains why the story never leaves people alone. Because beneath every talking animal and every ridiculous scene sits something recognizable. Confusion. Authority. Fear. Growing up, trying to understand a world that often makes absolutely no sense. That's not fantasy. That's life. And maybe Alice wasn't really trying to escape Wonderland. Maybe she was trying to understand it. Same as us. If you enjoyed falling headfirst into literary madness, like, subscribe, ring the bell, join the Pizzaverse. Because around here we examine history, Hollywood, mobsters, internet insanity, strange mysteries, and apparently psychologically damaging children's stories. 1 week you're learning about gangsters. The next week you're questioning rabbits. Life comes at you fast. And remember, sometimes the rabbit hole isn't fantasy. Sometimes history itself is crazier. Thank you, message. And to everybody sitting here with me today, the night crew, the replay crew, the people listening while pretending to work, Tupperware bandits, the people sneaking around on their spouses, the haters, the people hiding earbuds under hoodies, the people cleaning kitchens, the people eating leftover pizza, the people avoiding responsibilities, the people who accidentally clicked this and are now sitting there thinking, how the hell did I end up watching a documentary about Alice in Wonderland, mercury poisoning, Victorian drug culture, and missing diary pages? You are our people. You are appreciated. You belong here. Thank you for hanging out with Pizzaverse Studios and Palermo Productions. Seriously. Out of the entire internet, billions of videos, millions of creators, infinite distractions. You ended up down here in the rabbit hole with us? Questionable decision? Absolutely. But we appreciate it. Now go outside. Drink water. Touch grass. And maybe don't trust rabbits for a little while. We'll see you next time.
Painting the roses red, we're painting the roses red. We dare not stop or waste a drop, so let the paint painting the roses red. We're painting the roses red. Oh, painting the roses red. And many a tear we shed.
Because we know
They'll cease to grow.
In fact, they'll soon be dead.
Oh, and yet we go ahead, painting the roses red. Painting the roses red. We're painting the roses red.
Oh, pardon me, but Mr. Three, why must you paint them red?
Huh? Oh!
Well, the fact is, miss, we planted the white roses by mistake. And
The queen, she likes them red. If she saw white instead,
she'd raise a fuss, and each of us would quickly lose his head.
Goodness.
since this is a thought we dread, we're painting the roses red.
Oh, dear. Then let me help you. Painting the roses red.
We're painting the roses red. Don't tell the queen what you have seen or say that's what we said. But we're painting the roses red.
Yes, painting the roses red.
Not pink, not green.
Not aquamarine.
We're painting the roses red.